This is me. I live 2 blocks from here with my 2 kids. I have a company called Yapp where I write a lot of Ruby and JavaScript. And when I'm not doing those things, I like to play beach volleyball. So our JavaScript apps are getting bigger. And there was a time where this cowboy was a good idea. There's a little New York history for you. A few blocks over, 10th Avenue used to have a freight train running at street level on it. We're talking mid-1800s. And unfortunately, a lot of people got killed by that freight train. So they decided they were going to do something about it. And so the solution was to hire the West Side Cowboys. These guys ride their horses in front of the freight trains, waving a red flag to let people know that there was a freight train coming down the street. And like I said, at the time, it was probably a good idea. But the way I think about it is that's sort of the solution that we've had for packaging and organizing our JavaScript in the past. Things are starting to get better. What we need to do, obviously, is we need to apply the software engineering principles that we've learned in other environments to JavaScript, and that's happening with the MVC frameworks, that's happening with the test frameworks, and we're organizing our codes or starting to in ways that make sense, make things easier to find later. And the one thing I want to focus on in this talk is the build system. And the build system for JavaScript needs to support us doing iterative development, but it also needs to support the deployment story where we can deliver these JavaScript assets to their destinations, whether that's the browser or native wrappers, in a way that's efficient, performant, etc. So in the real world, JavaScript build systems tend to solve a few different problems. Concatenation, combining everything into one HTTP payload, minification, compression, make that stuff smaller, authoring in another language like CoffeeScript, stripping asserts from your source code is another way to save on some both performance and saving size, deferring parsing, template compilation, other things. And the tools that we use them are pretty common, probably well known to many of you. When you're designing a build system, the approach is pretty much, it makes a lot of sense. It's a pipeline. So we start with input on one end, and we have a series of filters that each transform that input until you get output on the other end. And so in the case of JavaScript, that probably looks like starting with a bunch of JavaScript files. This is an example. Wrap each file in a closure, minify each file, concatenate them into one file, and stick them in an output directory. So there's a bunch of Rails-focused solutions, the most famous of which, of course, ships in Rails 3, the asset pipeline. There's others. And outside the Ruby community, people use a variety of tools, some custom built to this purpose, other generic build tools like Ant and Make. And so with all these options, why am I here talking about Rake pipeline today? There's 2 reasons. One is pragmatically, it solved problems for us in my code base. But more importantly, this library is an example of what I love about Ruby, and I hope that you'll see what I mean as we go through this. First, a little bit of history. It's October 2011. A little company named Living Social needs some tooling for an Ember.js app that they're writing. So they hire a guy named Yehuda Katz who writes Rake pipeline. About a month later, at Yehuda's request, it's open sourced. And in talking with Yehuda about the idea here, he said that the concept is, this is a build system, let's model it as a build system. And if we do that, we have a much better shot at being able to grow and compose, to have this meet our needs, be able to compose pieces of the system. Now, if you're going to build a build system in Ruby, what's your first stop going to be? Anybody? Guesses? Rake. I know that's what you're going to say, Dr. Nick. I'm not going to go into Rake because we've got Jim Wyrick here who's going to do a way better job than I could possibly do. But there is one part of Rake that it's really important that you understand, and that's the file wrapper. The file wrapper is basically lets you create files, but it has a property that if the file that you're creating is newer than the file that are your inputs, it's going to skip that task. And this lets you create incremental builds, which is a really important part of having a fast build. So the foundational innovation of Rake pipeline is that we can take, this is an example of the file task. This foundational innovation is you can take these filters that are doing these transformations and dynamically create file tasks from them so that you get the beauty of this architecture that sort of fits the problem really well with the incremental build speed and using Rake under the hood. So what's a filter in Rake pipeline? It's a subclass of Rake pipeline filter that has your contract is that you need to provide this generate output method. And it takes an inputs and an collection of inputs and an output, and your responsibility is create that output. These are file wrapper classes, which is a Rake pipeline provided class, and it basically just abstracts away needing to know where on disk these files are and gives you easy ways to read and write it. So not only are these things easy to write, but they're also really easy to share. So there's GitHub repositories. This one from Yehuda. It's got a bunch of stuff that we'll commonly need. This one from Roman 2K if you're a required JS kind of fellow or gal. This is a good one to take a look at. The next key part of Rake pipeline is the DSL. This is how do you describe composing these filters together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this example that I mentioned before, and we're going to look at the code that's required to make this filter, this pipeline, a reality. So we start off with doing Rake pipeline build. And what this is going to do is create an instance of the pipeline DSL class, and then do an instance eval of everything that's inside. So the first thing, we have our inputs. So let's say we want everything in the app directory that ends in .js to be considered our inputs, and where our filters are going to go inside. So the first one, the closure filter, we'll declare simply like this, and we'll provide an implementation of it that's as simple as you'd expect. Our output is simply the contents of the input wrapped in an anonymous function and executed immediately. If you're not a JavaScript developer, you probably wonder why the heck would you want to do something like this? Really useful for information hiding, keeping the global scope clean. Happy to talk with you more about it on the boat. So next up is minifying each file, and for that we can use a filter that comes in with the Rake pipeline web filters project, uglify filter. You don't have to process all this, but it's the same basic idea using the uglifier gem to create the output. And then finally, we'll use the concat filter, specifying that we want it to go into a file named application.js. And then we'll say we want it in the dist directory. So here you've got a pretty expressive, pretty simple way to describe this pipeline that you want to have happen to your, the transformations that you want to have happen to your JavaScript. But because this is just a Ruby DSL and we're just instance evaling this pipeline DSL class, we can make this even more expressive. If we put it inside of a file called asset file in the root of the project, which is the convention for working with Rake pipeline, then we don't need this outside loop, this outside block, Rake pipeline build do, because when we're reading and executing it, Rake pipeline can do that for us. So it gets a little bit smaller. But then we can also define a module of our own, so where we can define a shortcut method, say closure, call filter closure filter like we did in the example, and include this module inside the pipeline DSL. What that lets us do is come here and shorten all this stuff to be really simple. And in fact, the Rake pipeline web filters project and Rake pipeline itself already includes helpers for uglify and concat. So I would challenge anybody to express in any programming language as simply and succinctly as this, that transformation process, that pipeline that we described earlier. The one other important part of the DSL is matchers. And essentially what matchers do is let you restrict the set of filters that run on particular types of files. So let's say we wanted to mix some CoffeeScript into this project. Maybe we want to experiment with it, see how it affects our coding style. What we can do is we can include that in the input. If you look on that second line there, include .coffee and .js stuff. And then for the .coffee files, we'll call the CoffeeScript filter. And what's cool is that anything that this matcher generates becomes part of the input for the next one. So this CoffeeScript file is going to produce .js files, which will then get a closure, get minified, and get concatenated. So we just added a whole nother authoring tool to our stack in 3.5 lines of code. Actually executing Rake pipeline, there's an executable that comes with the gem called Rake P. The first two commands are identical. Actually generates your output. Clean does what you'd expect, cleans up the temp directory and the output directory. And Rake P server fires up a development server that lets you preview in real time as you make changes. It'll generate that build and let you check it out. Under the hood, Rake P server uses middleware that you can use yourself. If you want to build your own development server, you want to integrate it into another stack. And that's Rake pipeline middleware. A Railtie also ships if you're using Rails 3, which will insert that middleware in the right place. So with that, I want to wrap things up and say thank you to the organizers and also to Mats, who makes writing code like this, made writing code like this possible and let us express ourselves and have a lot of joy in our work. So thanks all.